our presenter today, and we'll go ahead and get started. So we had Terry Durkin today presenting this for us, a great resource, very knowledgeable in this area. Terry is currently the Director of Development for Kuali Research. He's been in research administration for over 14 years. Terry's a seasoned technical leader with experience in research administration, finance, and other enterprise-scale software systems. And while at Indiana University, he led the successful implementation of the compliance, pre- and post-award Kuali COIAS modules, and he participated on several enterprise software committees, including taking a hands-on role in the enterprise adoption of agile development methodologies. Terry's been a leader in Kuali for over a decade, with experience ranging from participation on the original Kuali architecture team through the delivery of multiple Kuali Research releases. So with that, Terry, I will turn the webinar over to you, and then I'll join you later to moderate the questions.
Great, thank you, Dave. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. We're going to be talking today about Kuali Research APIs. Before we get into that, I just want to reassure everyone, whether you're from a technical background or from a functional background, we think that there's going to be some really good content in here for you to learn about how our full cradle-to-grave research system is even more powerful now than it's been before. Over the next half hour, 45 minutes, we're going to go through a few different stories. We're going to learn about how you can tell Kuali Research something that you may know in an institutional system that it doesn't know about. We're going to use an example that's pretty common in research administration, where users need to be trained on other systems or processes or procedures before maybe they're eligible to actually do research or participate on a research project. We're also going to learn about asking Kuali Research a question that you'd like to know the answer to, leveraging our APIs. And then we're going to go through a scenario where we're getting data out of Kuali Research using our new APIs and go through the process of analyzing that data, getting a little bit more interactive with it, and we're going to crunch the numbers that way. Before we get into those scenarios, I just want to go over some quick basics. Again, this is about as technical as the presentation gets, so if you're unfamiliar with these terms, or if you're very familiar with the terms, and this is review, just hang with us for a second. First of all, what is an API? APIs are there to define how software interacts with each other, or how people can interact with software either programmatically or via other means. Think of two systems using APIs as gears meshing really, really well and generating additional power to accomplish something that wasn't possible before. Without APIs, those gears might be running, but they're going to run into kinks, and you're going to have to unstick them sometimes, and you're going to have a little bit more disruption in the process that you're trying to accomplish. RESTful APIs, or REST, which stands for Representational State Transfer, is part of HTTP, which is the protocol of the web. HTTP and REST together define the verbs for interacting with web resources. For REST protocol APIs, that's typically putting things into a web service, posting them, getting them back, or deleting them. Therefore, REST APIs define a programmatic way for you to interact using those verbs with web resources. Now, when we talk about web resources, that's not necessarily a web page. A web page may actually leverage APIs, similar to what we'll talk about, to display data in a particular way or format. A web resource is really what drives that view that you're seeing. So we're going to go through an example. This example has nothing to do with Kuali Research. It's just to illustrate that point of the things that are accomplishable when you're using a mature, stable, well-written API. So for example, you'd like to know what the current temperature is in your locale, and you would like to use that in some other system or some other application. If you were going to do that without an API, you'd have to navigate to your favorite weather website. You'd have to type in the search box, the zip code or city, probably select a little bit more fine-grained. Once you get the results, you'd have to copy that URL, and at that point, you could begin to write a program. That program would first need to screen scrape the code to identify the content that you were looking for within that web page. Now, you can do all of that, but anytime that the layout of the website changes, which could be any time, websites change all the time, you would have to maintain that application, or you would have to maintain that integration, which could become cumbersome when really all you want to do is know and be able to display what the temperature is. So here's an example of that. This was the weather in my town a couple of days ago. You can see that I've searched for the town that I'm in, and in the red highlight box is really the only piece of data on this entire page that I'm interested in. If I were to just download or look at the source of the website, you can see that there's a lot of stuff in there that's about how the data is displayed that's very much geared towards the browser and how that displays to users who are viewing that through a web browser. You can see again in the red box that I've highlighted the specific part that I'm looking for, which is 68 and some computer speak for what I assume is degrees Fahrenheit. That becomes a lot simpler of an exercise with an API in place. In order to use an API to do that, we would identify, again, the source that we were looking for. In this case, I know my favorite weather website. I just looked on their site for APIs. I reviewed the documentation that they provided, learned how I needed to authenticate to that, and what was available to me. I called the API, and then I got results back that I can process and use in any way that I would like in another system or application. Converse to what we just looked at with the view source of that website, here you can see bolded. I can see specifically exactly what I'm looking for, that is 69 degrees Fahrenheit outside at the time that I ran this. So what does that have to do with Kuali Research? Well, let's talk a little bit about the Kuali Research technology and architecture. Kuali Research has been around for about 10 years as a Java web application. We're continuing to innovate and add exciting new features, such as what we're talking about today, to this mature system. It's fully featured, and we believe that with the addition of some of the things that we're talking about today with our APIs, you can actually leverage and extend it in new ways that haven't been possible for quite some time. We're also developing new modules using some new architecture. For the techies among us, we're using Node.js as a server-side architecture with a JavaScript front end using React.js. And integration between these modules is really, really critical. Your COI module, for instance, it's got to know about the projects that folks are working on. It's got to be able to talk to other parts of the system to understand what can a user do or who is the person that's logging in. We're actually using the APIs that I'm talking about today to integrate the different modules of Kuali Research as we go through some architectural changes. So what's available? So what can you actually do with these APIs right now today? The Kuali Research data model is big, as folks who've looked under the covers know. We have over 600 tables that are now directly accessible via our APIs. The functionality includes full create, read, update, and delete using those web verbs that I talked about before. We've got some really great features associated with those, so you can filter on resources that you're looking for. You can see the schema details of each of the endpoints and understand programmatically how you would deal with them. And we've also got some really robust documentation that describe how you can interact with each of these. In addition to the 600 or so table-driven APIs, we also are beginning to develop a series of custom APIs. If you're a current Kuali Research hosted customer in the cloud, you're probably already using our HR API to load your person data into the system. That's mature, robust, and allows us to not have to directly integrate with an institutional identity management system. We also have an existing and growing set of financial APIs, which allow two-way integration of award and account data into and out of your financial system or your ERP that you're running either on-premise or from another cloud provider. And then finally, we're beginning to use our custom APIs to actually facilitate data conversion from legacy systems into Kuali Research. Now, this part's actually really cool. Those of us who have actually been through multiple data conversion processes know that the traditional way of doing that is from one database schema to another. And you can get the size and shape of the data right, and you might be able to validate the foreign key constraints between the two systems. But you never know how successful that data conversion was until you actually get into the system and try to access the things that you've put in. Leveraging these APIs allows us to leverage all of the existing business rules that come out of the box with the system or have been configured for our customers in their instances of Kuali Research to ensure that as that data comes in via these APIs, that it's valid and users are going to have a great experience when they begin to actually use the system. Here's an example of the documentation. This is available right now on our public test drive systems. I will warn everyone, since there's a lot of APIs, this is a really big page, so it takes a little bit to load. But you can see, for example, all of the different ways that you can interact with our APIs, getting individual resources by either the primary key, getting lists of them, getting lists that include filtering. As I said, you can get the schema information. You can actually generate this documentation on the fly. And you can also update, insert, and delete into all of these as well. So that's great. But how do we make sure that the usage of these APIs is appropriate and makes sense for the users of this system? Well, I'm happy to say that these are both secure and safe. We have strong standards-based authentication, so we know exactly who is interacting with the APIs over these web resources. And then we also leverage the existing Kuali Research and RICE identity management system in order to provide fine-grained permissions to who can read and write at a very granular scale. So you can make sure that only folks who need to have access to certain resources have access to those resources. Finally, we have auditing in place, so we know exactly who, what, and when folks have done when they've integrated with our APIs. A couple of examples of how we're using these today. If you've seen our new budget rates management tool, which drastically eases the process of managing multiple proposal and award budget rates, then you've actually seen these APIs in action. Also, as I already mentioned, our COI module is integrated with the rest of Kuali Research via the APIs. So there are APIs in both directions that provide project data, that check permissions within COI against what the identity management system knows a user can do, to check parameters, to get other details about Kuali Research data that really customize the COI experience for our users. So all of that really just boils down to the following. You've got on the left side here a user who's using the system, and you've got on the right side here your different university applications. And the Kuali cloud, the Kuali Research hosted cloud, or your on-premise implementation of Kuali Research is what's facilitating the conversation between these two systems, your existing university applications, as well as the system itself. Okay, so let's get back to those three stories I mentioned. So we're going to work through these. Again, we're going to tell Kuali Research that a user has been trained and is now able to do something in the system that they weren't previously able to do. Then we're going to ask Kuali Research the number of new IRB protocols that have been approved. And then we're going to crunch the data, and we're going to be able to slice and dice submitted proposal dollars so we know exactly what we could forecast on when money could be coming into the university and what we would need to prepare for in order for PIs to be able to leverage those sponsored funds. So first of all, so how do we use these APIs to integrate institutional training data into Kuali Research? It's a fairly straightforward process, and we'll work through a demonstration of this as well. So the process is to identify the API that we want to use for person training. We want to use those web verbs to post and put data from an external system into Kuali Research, and then we're going to verify that the post worked. So let me just walk through that for you guys real quick. So real quick, before I actually do the demonstration, I want to preface this by letting everyone know that I'm using Google Sheets, and I've written some code behind the Google Sheets to actually interact with our APIs. I just want to underscore that our APIs are accessible to pretty much any programming language. This is just what I chose in order to have a visual representation of the data that we can get from the APIs and ways that we can interact with it. So on my Google Sheet, I'm going to first, actually before we do that, I'm going to look at Kuali Research, and this is the instance that the API that I'm going to leverage is running off of. I've got about 17 records in the person training table, but when I look for myself, there's no records here for me. I really need to let the system know that I've been trained. I could do that through the UI, but we're going to go through the API now as well, because from a programmatic perspective, if you've got an institutional resource that has your training data, you would probably want to leverage that instead of printing a report and then entering hundreds or more records into the system. So first I'm going to get the training data. And you can see we have the same 17 records that we just saw in the Kuali Research Live instance. I know that my user ID is 82, and this is my first training, and this is the training type. I was asked to do this training on the 1st of the month. I actually submitted the training about a week later. It was acknowledged institutionally a week or so after that, and this particular training is good for 2 years. Of course, I got a score of 100, and my reviewer said, "You rock." So now you'll notice a couple things. I didn't put in a value for the person training ID. That's actually the primary key in the database, and we want to put new data into it. So we're going to let the system assign the primary key. And then there's a status column that right now says undefined. When we submit this data to Kuali Research, you'll see both of those things change. So you can see now that I have an ID, and the system actually tried to process these additional records as well. So if we had made changes to these, they would have been posted, and we can verify that our training data is in the system. Again, I'm searching for myself. I hit the search button, and now there's a new record. I was trained. The date requested was on May 1st. I submitted it a week later. It was acknowledged. It's good for 2 years. Of course, I rock. And the training type is the webinar demo training. So that example showed getting data out of the system. You notice there were some codes in there that users may not be super familiar with. They'd have to look up in the system maybe, what is my person ID? What is the training code? We're actually going to go through another exercise now where we're going to make that a little bit more clear. This is our ask exercise. Again, we want to ask the system the number of new IRB protocols that have been approved. And the scenario there is we're going to get a list of protocol submissions. We're going to, again, identify the protocol submission API that we want to use. Because we want this to look a little bit nicer, we actually want to hit another API to get the submission status. And then we're going to pass data back to the API to use that filtering criteria so we know that we're getting the things that we want to get. And again, we're going to process and display the results. So again, on my Google Sheet that I've prepared, you can see that I've got the proposal submission status code. This is pre-filled from the API. Again, I just want to emphasize that just for demonstration purposes, I'm using this particular platform. you could really use literally anything that, that has a network connection that can talk to the web in order to interact with these APIs. So now that I've chosen the protocol submission status that I want to filter on, I can get those from the system. It just takes a couple of seconds. And I can see now that I have these protocol numbers. If there's versions, they're in there. I can have I can see the submission date, the protocol review type, and then whether or not a vote took place and what that vote was. We can also filter on other criteria using the same API and get protocol submission data filtering off of any other submission type. So here you can see that we only have a handful of protocols that have been submitted to committee but haven't been reviewed yet. Again, in this case, the protocol review type, that's actually being looked up from another API. So we're actually using one API to get the values that we want to filter off of. We're calling into the protocol API to pull the data down, and then we're getting the actual details in a more readable, human-friendly form so we can actually see the data. That was pretty quick for the amount of data and the amount of transactions that it was using to talk to the system. The final story that we're going to tell today is how to crunch some data, how to crunch numbers out of the system. Now, if you're a Kuali hosted customer, you already have access to our great analytics platform. You can do a lot of the things that we'll look at in that platform. But if you want to get a little bit more interactive with that data, if you want to, for some reason, use it on your desktop, if you want to have it in a format that that you have a little bit more interactivity with, you can certainly do that. You can also, if you're using Kuali Research not as a hosted customer, you could use something similar to what I'm about to show in order to analyze your data. So again, the scenario is getting submitted proposals and analyzing the data. So I'm going to identify the API that I want to use. I'm going to pull the data. I'm going to process it into my spreadsheet. And then I'm going to create a pivot table to be able to slice and dice that and get more insights into the data that I'm returning. So this one's doing a few more things, and there's more proposal data in the system. So we're going to let it pull the data. This is actually making a couple of, one call to get the filtered data from the API. And then for each record, it's actually going back and getting a little bit more detail in order to be able to slice and dice it in the way that we want it to. As this is loading, again, I just want to emphasize that this is the platform that I've chosen for these demonstrations, just so we can visualize the interactivity of the APIs a little bit more. Also, interesting, of all of the demonstrations, the code behind them, of course that changes from platform to platform, is really, really small. I think the biggest of any of the programs that's pulling the data from the system here is only about 75 or 80 lines of code, and you can see that we're actually doing quite a bit with that. So now that the data is returned, we can see that we've got the proposal numbers, the unit numbers, the sponsor name. The data in the database is actually stored with the sponsor code, so it's actually going back to ask for more information about the sponsor name. We're getting the requested start date. We're actually calculating the period fiscal year, assuming a July 1st fiscal year. And then we're taking the two database stored fields, the initial year direct cost and initial year indirect cost, and we're summing those together in order to get a total cost. I've gone ahead and prepared a pivot table that shows how you can interact with this data. So by fiscal year, by sponsor here at the top, we're seeing how much money has been requested of each of these sponsors. You can drill in. This is the capability of the tool, of the platform, in order to see the units and where the unit and which units have requested those funds. Pretty cool. So just to wrap up, Kuali Research is a full-featured grants management and compliance management research administration system. Folks have appreciated and used the functionality of the system for years, but now we're providing new ways to access your data. It's secure, it can be real-time, and it allows you to get interactive and extend the functionality of quality research in new and interesting ways. Our APIs also allow you to extend the existing system functionality without customizing the code. The example of integrating with a local training database is an example of systems that are talking and can even talk in real time from one system to another without any code modifications happening within the system. That really opens up the potential for how you interact with your systems and how you leverage the data that already exists. And again, our APIs allow you to build new, very powerful features for new types of insights and interactivity with your existing enterprise research data. So what if you get into it and you realize, wow, these APIs are really great. I have a question. I've got, I don't know if it can do this. I want to see, I want a new API that does something that you guys haven't thought of yet. Well, give us a yodel. We want to hear that. And you can see at the top, this is a similar diagram as we saw before. But at the top, here are our happy quality research developers. I'll let you guys guess which one I am based on the initial picture, if you remember back then. And I'll send you a pan of brownies if you guess right. But here you can see that because of our continuous delivery platform and our frequent releases, all you have to do is let us know that there's something that the system needs to do that would add value to you and your users. That gets prioritized into our next releases. We actually release on our continuous delivery platform a few times a week, so typically the turnaround on those types of things isn't very long, and then it's available to everyone in order to leverage and extend the capability and functionality of the software. So that wraps up my presentation portion today. Dave, do we have any questions?
Thanks, Terry. Man, that was really cool. You covered a lot of ground. It's really helpful to see how we can use these new APIs to better leverage the data in Kuali. I wish they were around when I was using COIUS at Albany. Yep, we do have a number of questions, but those of you who haven't answered them, it's still not too late. Please, as we're going through the questions, don't hesitate to add more if you need them. And if we don't have time to get to any of the questions, we will reach out to you individually and provide answers for you. And just a reminder, we did record this session, and we will be sending you a link to the recording that you can use to refresh your memories or share with colleagues who couldn't attend. All right, let me get to the questions. And I'm going to read the first question verbatim. I'm going to try to put the exclamation point in. Oh, wow! With an exclamation point. Is the data conversion API used for legacy data?
Yeah, that's actually the whole point of the data conversion API. Certainly, if you're coming from a previous version of Kuali Research, or if you're migrating from Kuali or from MIT COIUS, we know what your data looks like, and we've actually got procedures where we can really, really quickly and pretty seamlessly upgrade you to the latest Kuali Research code. The data conversion APIs are really meant for other legacy, third-party, unknown data systems. The way that those work is we actually just let you know the format that programmatically this is what we think a proposal looks like, or this is how the system knows what a proposal looks like. You can fill in the data. All of our APIs use JavaScript object notation, or JSON for shorthand. So we would define the schema for you of the JSON object that we would expect. You would have to take the legacy data, format it into the format specified by the API, and then you just post that data into the system. And when you post the data into the system, it actually runs through all of the same business rules and validations that are leveraged when when a user is actually interacting with the system. So to the system, it's just dealing with a proposal development document or an institutional proposal version or an award or something like that.
Okay. The example you showed about training data using the Google Sheets is awesome. How much technical expertise do you think a user needs to be able to create something like that?
It doesn't take a lot. The barrier of entry, I think, is pretty low. Again, the most code that I had behind any of these examples was about 75 lines, and honestly, most of that was just formatting it to put the headers bolded and to get the data from the payload back into the system. So that API actually, that example actually used the person training API in a variety of ways. It pulled the data so we could display it externally, and then it had to know whether or not it was an existing record or a new record. And so that determined whether or not we would put or post. And then, again, it uses the notation, the schema for transmitting the data. You can actually show what that looks like, and you can actually ask the system, hey, what does a record of this type need to look like? And then as long as you format the data, and it's really just text at that point, as long as you format it according to that and call the right method on the API, it should be pretty seamless. So the barrier of entry technologically is very low. And again, just to reemphasize that these APIs are about defining how the systems communicate with one another. So you don't have to be a Java expert. You know, Kuali Research, I said already, is a pretty big Java program, but you don't have to be a Java expert in order to leverage these APIs. If you're more comfortable with .NET or with PHP or Perl or Ruby or something like that, we're just defining the way that you talk to the system, and then the system takes it over from there. So just to reemphasize, fairly low technical skill required, low barrier of entry, as well as allowing technical folks to work within a paradigm that they're already used to and comfortable with.
Okay. Okay, Terry, question. What is the strategy of making changes to the APIs? For example, when a new field is added to a table in Kuali Research?
That's a great question. So, excuse me, because the way that our APIs are defined using JSON, there could be times when, hey, a new field shows up in the API that wasn't there before. We try to minimize that because these do need to be stable. Our contract and our API versioning specifies that we're not going to make significant changes to the way that these things work, and we're going to communicate about deprecating them before they were ever significantly altered or removed. The API versioning scheme, if you look at our documentation right now, pretty much is that everything is at version 1, but as we get more mature and as we get to a point where we feel like we would be making a change that could potentially be incompatible with the way that folks could be using the APIs already, then we would increment the version of that. We would deprecate and indicate that the previous version was deprecated, and then we would work with folks to make sure that they had a smooth transition to the new version.
Okay. During the presentation, you mentioned 600 tables with APIs and robust documentation. How do we know which tables and data fields are available?
So in the Kuali Research instances that if you're running the latest code, or if you go out to one of the instances that are running right now, there's actually a URL, and we can share that after this and make sure that it's visible within the application itself. But it actually shows the generated API documentation. If you're using the software, if you're running it yourself on-premise, then that's actually delivered right now, and so there's a path in the system, just whatever your normal API path is, /API docs, and that will show you all the APIs that we have. They're organized into about 7 or 8 different categories. We've got the system level stuff. We've got common, so things like sponsors or people or units and things like that are all within the common. And then from there, they're broken out further between the actual functional modules within the system. Each of those modules also has its own endpoints API that you can actually hit, and the system will actually tell you in real time, hey, these are the endpoints that I know about underneath the research common or the research SIST or within the institutional proposal paths. Again, if you have questions, feel free to join our community mailing lists. We've got some collaboration lists that are fairly active and folks try to respond pretty quickly on. We have folks who are beginning to use the APIs in new ways, and they might be able to share their experiences with you on how they've leveraged them. And we also have a couple official support channels that we'd be happy to respond to as well if you needed more information about how to access the APIs or what specific capabilities exist.
Okay. Another question. Are there any plans to utilize these APIs to develop BI dashboards?
That's a great question. Right now, we actually have a quality analytics product that's bundled into our hosted offering. BI dashboards, could be a part of that or could be a part of quality research going forward. We're undergoing some user experience redesign, and so I think you'll start to see more embedded insights that are driven by the data within the system and potentially our analytics platform as part of those rewrites. Certainly, an institution, either hosted or on-premise, could leverage the APIs to pull data down on a periodic schedule to be able to get, again, more hands-on with that data and maybe a more familiar setting that was more integrated with maybe some of their other university systems.
All right. Here's another person who lectured Google Sheets. The Google Sheets implementation of the API calls is quite useful. Would you be able to share an example of how you incorporated this?
Sure, I can actually do that live. So here's my demonstration. So Google Sheets, there's actually a script editor. If you're familiar with Excel and Visual Basic macros and stuff like that, it's very similar. This is actually using JavaScript dialect. I'm going to remove, I'm going to quickly go through these. But here you can see that basically we are specifying that we want to get the training. This guy right here, that's what's getting the data. The tool itself is actually going out and parsing it, and then we're just processing it. I don't want to spend too much time on that right now, but again, that's just an example of, that whole training thing is 83 lines of code, including the post and the get and the put. And I'd be happy to share that with anyone who wants to get in touch after the webinar or put that up on GitHub for folks who wanted to refer to it.
Okay. Here's another one. I'm part of our IT staff, and I'm going to start playing with these APIs to see if I can use them on our campus. Is there any training available where I could learn how to use these APIs if I run into problems?
So there's a couple of resources that you can go to. Again, we have the community list that you could talk to. We've got support mechanisms as well. You could reach out to folks like me who could help you along. We also had really well-received training at last year's Kuali Days, and I would anticipate that we'll have something similar this year since we've actually got even more to show off and share and to help folks get comfortable with.
Okay.